Jax Viro had a problem. Actually, Jax had a lot of problems, but today's problem was a bit more exotic than the usual crap he dealt with in Astroluma, the galaxy's most depressing underground city. Astroluma wasn't just a place where dreams came to die. It was where they got mugged, stripped naked, and left in a ditch to think about their life choices. And speaking of life choices, Jax's best friend, Corflick, was about to make him regret his. Corflick wasn't exactly what you'd call normal, even by alien standards. With 6 wobbling tentacles and an eye that never quite stopped twitching, Corflick was the kind of alien you avoided at parties unless you were feeling particularly masochistic or had a strong stomach for bad jokes. Today, though, Corflick was being unusually quiet, a sure sign of trouble. "Jax," Corflick gurgled, his voice like someone gargling marbles, "I think I found something." Jax paused, wiping the dirt off his hands. Archaeology was mostly dirt, dust, and disappointment, but every now and then you hit the jackpot, or in this case the potential bomb. "Please don't say it's another rock," Jax sighed. "I can't handle another look, a rock but slightly shinier moment." Corflick waved a tentacle dismissively, which in any other context would have looked like a drunk octopus trying to start a fight. "Nah, not a rock, an artifact." The word artifact hung in the air like a bad smell. Artifacts in Astroluma were about as common as honest politicians. Jax's interest peaked, despite his better judgment. "Artifact, huh? Let me guess, it's cursed, or it screams when you touch it, or it's got a habit of causing existential dread." Corflick chuckled, a sound not unlike a blender full of gravel. "Nope, just old and shiny." "Old and shiny's my favorite combo," Jax grinned, brushing past his friend to get a better look. Nestled in the dirt was something that looked like a metallic liver, small, sleek, with no discernible function unless someone was really desperate for a paperweight. Jax poked it gingerly. "How's this for a treasure? Looks like someone's spleen decided to take up metalwork." Corflick shrugged, "A Herculean task for someone with no shoulders. Beats the time you found that historic beer can." Jax rolled his eyes. "Hey, that can was a week old and still full," Corflick interrupted. "But this is a find." While Jax contemplated their strange metallic discovery, Astroluma was busy dealing with a different kind of madness. The Alien Council had just passed a new law. Not a law about something sensible like littering or not setting your neighbor on fire, but a law banning sarcasm. "That's just great," Jax muttered, sarcasm all but dripping from his voice. "Who needs humor when you have laws like that?" Corflick snorted. "A sarcasm ban. Might as well ban breathing while they are at it." But the council wasn't interested in breathing or logic. They wanted order, and in a place like Astroluma, where cynicism was as common as oxygen, sarcasm was public enemy number 1. Jax leaned back, resting against the wall of the excavation site as he contemplated how much Astroluma sucked right now. "You know what's worse than living in a grimy asteroid city with a sarcasm ban?" Corflick raised an eyebrow. At least Jax assumed he did under those twitchy tentacles. "Living in a grimy asteroid city with a sarcasm ban and no alcohol." "Exactly," Jax nodded. "What's next?" "A ban on sarcasm's best friend, irony." "They'll have to take my irony from my cold, dead tentacles," Corflick declared, dramatically waving an appendage. As they bantered, a group of aliens passed, eyes darting nervously. The sarcasm ban had everyone on edge, and even a harmless joke could now land you in deep trouble. In Astroluma, that usually meant a fine or, at worst, a trip to the council's re-education chambers, which were about as fun as they sounded. "I bet the re-education chambers come with a free lobotomy," Jax smirked. Corflick snorted. "And a complimentary tinfoil hat." Their humor was a small rebellion, a way to cope with a city that seemed determined to strip away every last joy. Still, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that their little artifact find was going to complicate their lives even more. "So," Jax said, poking the artifact again, "what do we do with this thing?" "Sell it, obviously," Corflick replied. "Or maybe it's the key to an ancient treasure." Jax raised an eyebrow. Right, because every random metal spleen is a treasure map, Corflick laughed, a sound like someone attempting to speak through a running vacuum. Hey, you never know. Just then, a loud siren blared through the tunnels of Astroluma, a sound that typically meant one of three things: imminent death, an incoming asteroid, or a council announcement. None were particularly thrilling prospects. The voice of the council leader, a particularly humorless alien named Xylax, echoed through the intercoms. Attention, citizens of Astroluma, the sarcasm ban is now in effect. Anyone caught violating this law will face severe penalties. I bet Xylax has a personality in there somewhere, Jax whispered to Corflick. Just buried under layers of bureaucratic nonsense. Corflick grinned. More like buried under a mountain of self-importance. The announcement ended, but the oppressive weight of the ban lingered like a bad smell. Jax stared at the artifact, wondering if maybe, just maybe, it was their ticket out of this hellhole. What if this thing's worth something? Jax mused, scratching his chin. Worth something like enough to bribe a council member, Corflick joked. Or enough to get us the hell out of Astroluma, Jax replied, his voice tinged with hope and a healthy dose of skepticism. They both knew it was a long shot, the kind of dream that ended in disappointment more often than not. But in a city filled with laws that defied logic and a council that seemed hell-bent on eradicating anything resembling fun, sometimes a long shot was all you had. As they sat there contemplating their next move, the siren blared again, this time accompanied by the sound of footsteps. A lot of footsteps. Looks like we're about to have company, Corflick noted, his voice tinged with both excitement and dread. Probably not here to congratulate us on our find, Jax muttered, standing up and dusting off his pants. The footsteps grew louder, and soon, a group of heavily armed alien enforcers rounded the corner, their expressions as unfriendly as a rabid dog on a bad day. Great, Jax said, turning to Corflick with a wry smile. You wanted excitement, right? Corflick nodded, his eye twitching more than usual. I was hoping for the kind that doesn't end in doom. The lead enforcer, a creature with more limbs than sense, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing on Jax and Corflick. We've heard humans, rumors of sarcasm. Jax sighed, crossing his arms. Rumors, must have been a slow day if we're the highlight. The enforcer's eyes narrowed further. Careful, human. Sarcasm is a serious offense. Right? Because that's the only thing wrong with this city, Jax shot back, his patience wearing thin. Before the situation could spiral further out of control, Corflick intervened. We're just humble archaeologists, he said, holding up a tentacle in what he hoped was a placating gesture. No sarcasm here, just dirt and disappointment. The enforcer grunted, clearly unimpressed but not wanting to waste any more time on what he probably considered a couple of lowlifes. We'll be watching you, he warned, turning to leave with his entourage in tow. As the enforcers left, Jax and Corflick exchanged a relieved glance. The excitement had been brief, but enough to remind them of the precariousness of their situation. Well, that was fun, Jax said, rolling his eyes. As fun as a root canal, Corflick agreed. With the law breathing down their necks and a discovery that might just be their way out, Jax felt the familiar stirrings of hope, a dangerous emotion in a place like Astroluma. So you think this thing's really worth something? Jax asked, looking at the artifact again, this time with a glimmer of determination. Corflick shrugged. Worth a shot, right? Jax nodded, pocketing the artifact with a newfound resolve. Then let's find out before someone else decides it's their next paperweight. As they headed out of the excavation site, the oppressive weight of Astroluma's laws still loomed. But for the first time in a long time, Jax felt a flicker of rebellion, a tiny spark of defiance against a city that had long since given up on its humanity. To the next adventure, then, Corflick said, his voice a mix of sarcasm and sincerity. Jax grinned, clapping his friend on the back. And may it not kill us. With that, they stepped into the shadows of Astroluma, ready to face whatever grim insanity came their way next. Jax had a lot of regrets in life, but right now, he really wished he hadn't gotten out of bed. Corflick was leading the way through Astroluma's maze of tunnels, and Jax was trying to keep up without tripping over his own feet. The artifact was secure in his pocket, but it felt like a lead weight. Hopefully, it was a lead weight that doubled as an ancient key to something special, like the lost civilization's intergalactic brewery. So, Jax began trying to distract himself from the oppressive atmosphere of Astroluma. Where exactly are we taking this thing? Corflick turned his head, or what Jax assumed was his head, towards him. There's a guy I know, Renzik. Supposedly knows a thing or two about ancient tech. Supposedly, Jax asked, raising an eyebrow. Well, his last tip got us this far, Corflick replied. And by got us this far, I mean he hasn't gotten us killed yet. High praise indeed, Jax muttered, sidestepping a particularly pungent puddle. Astroluma had a way of reminding you it didn't care about your shoes, or your soul for that matter. They rounded a corner and the usual buzz of the underground city reached them. But today, it was punctuated by tense whispers and furtive glances. The Sarcasm ban was in full swing, and the city felt like a powder keg waiting for someone to light the fuse. Jax caught sight of a group of aliens clustered around the entrance to a dilapidated bar, their attention fixated on a scene unfolding in the street. He and Corflick slid closer to get a better look. A small, wiry man was being dragged out by two burly enforcers, his face a mix of outrage and disbelief. Come on, it was a joke, he protested, struggling against his captors. I said the council meetings were about as lively as a rock concert on mute, the crowd murmured, some laughing nervously, others looking around to see who else might be caught in the sarcasm sweep. Jax felt a chill run down his spine. The man's protest was pointless. Everyone knew that once the enforcers got you, your next stop was the re-education chambers, and the only thing that was certain about that place was that you'd come out the other side a lot less sarcastic, if you came out at all. Poor bastard, Jax murmured, shaking his head. Corflick sighed, a sound like a deflating accordion. You'd think the council had bigger problems to tackle, like the fact the whole city's on the brink of going under, but no. It's always easier to pick on the little guys, Jax said, as the enforcers hauled the man away, his shouts drowning in the grim silence of the crowd. They moved on, the incident a stark reminder of how precarious their situation was. Jax felt the weight of the artifact in his pocket again. Was it hope, or just another burden? Let's hope your guy Renzik has some good news, Jax said, as they approached a rusting door set into the tunnel wall. Corflick knocked in a pattern that sounded suspiciously like a half-remembered tune. After a moment, the door creaked open to reveal a tall, lanky figure with skin that shimmered like oil on water. Renzik's eyes flickered from Jax to Corflick, then back again. What have you got for me? Renzik asked, his voice like gravel rolling down a tin roof. Corflick waved a couple of tentacles dramatically, as if introducing a magician to the stage. This, he said, gesturing for Jax to show the artifact. Jax pulled it from his pocket and placed it on the counter. Renzik eyed it with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Looks like a metal spleen, Renzik said, echoing Jax's earlier sentiment. Right, Jax replied, but Corflick thinks it might be more than that. Renzik picked it up, turning it over in his hands. He squinted as if he could discern its secrets through sheer force of will. Finally, he set it down, his expression shifting to one of reluctant intrigue. You ever heard of the Aegis Protocol? The what now? Jax asked, trying to remember if he'd ever come across that term in his less-than-stellar academic career. The Aegis Protocol, Renzik repeated. Supposedly, it's a defensive measure devised by an ancient civilization to protect their most valuable technologies. Keeps their stuff safe from anyone who doesn't know the right password, so to speak. And you think this has something to do with that? Corflick asked, his eye doing its usual dance. Renzik shrugged, a gesture that seemed to involve most of his elongated frame. Could be. There's some script on the underside. Could be coordinates, could be gibberish. But if it is coordinates, it might lead to something valuable. So, you're saying this could be a map to lost tech? Jax asked, a flicker of excitement breaking through his usual cynical demeanor. Or it could be a paperweight, Renzik said, dampening the mood. But if you want to find out, you'll need someone who can decode it. Great, a treasure hunt with a side of translation, Jax muttered. Any idea who can help with that? Renzik gave them a toothy grin. Oh, I know a guy. Jax and Corflick exchanged a look. They both knew what that meant. Another shady contact, another risky endeavor. But what choice did they have? Staying in Astroluma under the current regime felt like a slow death. All right, where do we find this guy? Jax asked. He's more of a she actually, Renzik replied, sliding a piece of paper across the table. Name's Lyra. She's got a shop down in the Smog district. Jax took the paper, noting the location and some scrawled notes that looked like they were written by someone with tentacles for fingers. Smog district, huh? Sounds delightful. Oh, it is, Renzik said with a chuckle. Don't forget your gas masks. Corflick gestured his thanks with a flourish of tentacles, and they left Renzik's place with a mix of hope and dread. As they made their way through the tunnels, Jax couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. The Sarcasm ban was more than just a new rule. It was a cloud hanging over their heads, a reminder that any misstep could be their last. You think this Lyra chick is gonna be any help? Jax asked as they navigated the winding paths toward the Smog district. She's the best at what she does, Corflick replied. And if she can't decode this thing, nobody can. It wasn't exactly comforting, but it was something. They passed more enforcers on their way, their presence a constant, oppressive reminder of the city's new reality. Jax wondered how long it would be before they caught someone else in their net, how long before it was him or Corflick, facing the grim march to the re-education chambers. Ever feel like we're just delaying the inevitable? Jax asked, half joking, half serious. Corflick shrugged, his tentacles moving in what Jax had come to think of as an alien's version of a sigh. Life's nothing but a series of stalling tactics. Well, let's hope this one's worth the trouble, Jax said, checking the directions again as they approached the Smog district. The air grew thicker, the smell of burning chemicals, and something Jax didn't want to think about clinging to them like an unwanted second skin. For a place called the Smog district, it certainly lived up to its name. Charming, Jax muttered, pulling his shirt over his nose in a futile attempt to block the smell. Corflick, for his part, seemed unbothered. You get used to it. I'd rather not, Jax replied, scanning the buildings for any sign of Lyra's shop. They finally spotted it, a building that looked like it had been cobbled together from spare parts and broken dreams. Inside, the shop was cluttered but organized in a way that suggested the owner knew exactly where everything was, even if no one else did. Lyra herself was a diminutive woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, her hands moving with practiced precision as she tinkered with a contraption that looked like a time machine made from scrap metal. You must be the guys Renzik sent, she said without looking up, her voice like a laser cutting through the haze. That's us, Jax replied, holding up the artifact. He said you might be able to help with this. Lyra took it from him, examining it with a critical eye. Renzik's right, this is interesting. Interesting good or interesting bad? Jax asked. Interesting, I can't believe this didn't get melted down for parts ages ago, Lyra replied, setting the artifact on her workbench. But if there's something worth finding, I'll find it. Great, Corflick said. And how long do you think that'll take? Lyra looked up, one eyebrow raised. How much patience do you have? Not much, Jax admitted. Then you might want to grab a drink, she suggested, shooing them away with a wave of her hand. I'll call you when I have something. As they left the shop, Jax felt a mixture of hope and anxiety bubbling up inside him. The artifact might be their ticket out of Astroluma, or it might just be another dead end. But at this point, any chance to escape the city's oppressive grip was worth pursuing. You ever think about what you'd do if we actually managed to get out of here? Jax asked as they headed back through the streets. Corflick paused, his eye twitching thoughtfully. Find a planet where sarcasm is still legal. Maybe open a bar, Jax chuckled. You'd make a terrible bartender. Yeah, but at least I'd be a free one, Corflick replied, his voice tinged with sincerity beneath the sarcasm. Jax nodded, appreciating the sentiment. In a city where freedom was a fading memory, even the smallest dreams felt monumental. As they made their way back through the underground pathways of Astroluma, Jax couldn't help but think about the arrested man, about all the people living under the Council's thumb. He didn't know if the artifact was the key to their salvation or just another shiny piece of junk, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let the Council's rules crush his spirit. Not without a fight, anyway. It wasn't paranoia if they really were out to get you, and in Astroluma, the they in question was usually the Council. Jax and Corflick had barely left Lyra's shop when a group of enforcers plodded past them, eyes as empty as their souls. Jax tried to stare at the floor, hoping to avoid any interaction that might require a personality lobotomy in the re-education chambers. Keep walking like you've nothing to hide, Jax mumbled to Corflick, his eyes darting nervously. Nothing to hide. I'm a walking heap of secrets and bad decisions, Corflick replied, his tentacles twitching with anxiety. If I could whistle nonchalantly, I would. Jax smirked despite himself. Let's not give them any more reasons to haul us in. The enforcers, thankfully oblivious to the duo's guilty-looking amble, continued on their way. Jax exhaled, relief swirling in the foul-smelling air like a temporary reprieve from doom. Astroluma had never been a place of sunshine and roses, but lately it felt like living in a grim novella where everyone was the butt of a cosmic joke. Once in the relative safety of Jax's modest abode, a cramped cavern that made a coffin look spacious, they set about examining their options. The artifact lay on the table like a piece of junkyard art, mocking their desperation. Jax couldn't shake the feeling that it was laughing at them in a language they didn't understand. So the plan is what? Corflick asked, using one eye to keep lookout through the cracked window just in case. Stare at it until it reveals its secrets. Jax ran a hand through his hair, which was starting to feel like a bird's nest after too many days without a shower. Yeah, well, staring might be all we've got right now. We just need to keep low until Lyra figures out the puzzle. Low profile in Astroluma is like trying to hide a spaceship in your back pocket, Corflick remarked, not entirely wrong. Jax couldn't argue with that. The city was a labyrinth of backstabbers and opportunists, each more eager than the last to rat out their neighbors for a sniff of ration credits. Worse, the sarcasm ban had broken down whatever facade of camaraderie people might have clung to. Gallows humor had been the glue that held this place together, and now it was like living in a dystopian silent film. The pair sat in uneasy silence, the kind that stretched like a cat in the sun but lacked any warmth. Jax couldn't help but think of the last time he'd been in a situation this tense. It had involved a bottle of dubious liquor, a bet he shouldn't have made, and an angry, now one-legged pirate. Good times. Remember when we thought the worst thing we'd have to worry about was that one-legged pirate? Jax asked, mostly to break the silence. What was his name again? Corflick's eye brightened at the memory. Captain Stump. Peg, Captain kicks like a mule, if I recall, Jax said, grinning. Nice to know not all our bad decisions end with us dead. Yet, Corflick added, because he was always one for optimism. The momentary levity was like a cheap cigar, briefly satisfying but leaving a bitter aftertaste. They both knew that their current predicament was much worse than an angry pirate with a vendetta. The Council's watchful eyes were everywhere, and even the walls seemed to have ears these days. We should probably move, Jax said, pulling himself to his feet with all the enthusiasm of a condemned man. Too many eyes around here, Corflick agreed, reluctantly slithering to the door. Any idea where we're going, or is this another one of your winging-it scenarios? Jax flashed a confident smile that masked his uncertainty. Winging it is my middle name. Jax Winging It Viro. Rolls off the tongue, don't you think? Sure, if you're into nonsense names, Corflick replied, nudging the door open a crack. Let's just hope Renzik's directions hold water. I'd hate to end up in a place even worse than this. The streets outside Jax's place were unusually quiet, which made his skin prickle with discomfort. Nothing good ever came from silence in Astroluma. It was the kind of quiet that screamed of an impending storm, a storm with jackboots and electro-batons. They snaked through back alleys and shadowy passages, Jax leading with the confidence of someone who had absolutely no idea if they were going the right way. Left here, he decided, mostly because right looked suspiciously like a dead end. Corflick followed, making snarky comments about Jax's internal compass, which was right about as often as a broken clock. They paused occasionally to listen for the telltale clomp of enforcer boots or the hum of surveillance drones, but the city seemed eerily devoid of both. Maybe the council's off having a strategy meeting on how to make life even more intolerable, Corflick suggested, half joking. Probably trying to decide whether to outlaw breathing next, Jax quipped, though the thought wasn't far-fetched. Or maybe they're plotting the next big raid. Good times, Corflick said dryly, peering around a corner. How much farther? Jax checked the crumpled note from Renzik. Not far. Just past the obsolete power grid. If you start seeing sparks and smelling ozone, we're there. Great. Death by electrocution was on my bucket list, Corflick sighed, following Jax as they continued through the winding paths. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with tension and the acrid smell of neglect. Buildings loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their facades crumbling from years of disrepair and apathy. It was the kind of place where hope went to die and dreams were mugged in broad daylight. Charming neighborhood, Jax commented, trying to find the silver lining in a lead cloud. Real estate prices must be a steal, Corflick replied, humor laced with irony. They finally reached a warn sign that read obsolete power grid keep out. The grid was a sprawling mass of tangled wires and rusting pylons, like the skeleton of a long-dead beast. Jax wondered why anyone would choose to live near something so hazardous, until he remembered that beggars couldn't be choosers, especially in Astroluma. There better be something worthwhile at the end of this, Corflick grumbled, avoiding a puddle that looked suspiciously like it could dissolve a boot. Just think of it as an adventure, Jax suggested, already scanning for the entrance Renzik had mentioned. Adventure is just trouble that hasn't happened yet, Corflick muttered, following Jax's lead. They found the entrance wedged between two pylons, a door that had seen better days and probably better centuries. It was locked, of course, because nothing was ever easy. Jax fumbled with a set of lockpicks as Corflick kept watch, both of them hyper-aware of the ticking clock of doom hovering over their heads. Got it, Jax whispered triumphantly as the lock clicked open. After you, my brave tentacled companion. Age before beauty, Corflick replied, slinking inside with all the grace a multi-tentacled being could muster. The interior was dark, save for the occasional flicker of faulty lighting. Jax switched on a handheld torch, casting a narrow beam that danced over walls lined with more wires and panels than he could count. It was like stepping into the guts of an ancient machine, forgotten by time but still ticking. Welcome to the heart of Astroluma's forgotten infrastructure, Jax announced, his voice echoing slightly. Hope your torch holds out, Corflick said, his voice tinged with apprehension. This place gives me the creeps. They moved cautiously, aware that their footsteps might draw attention from things best left undisturbed. Every creak and groan of the old structure set Jax's nerves on edge, like the whole place was about to collapse and blame them for the inconvenience. Just another day in paradise, Jax remarked, as they descended deeper into the grid's bowels. Paradise needs some serious redecorating, Corflick added, eyeing a suspiciously sparking junction box. Finally, they reached a small, hidden alcove, a safe room if one could call it that. It was home to a collection of mismatched furniture and a bank of antique monitors that buzzed with static. Jax set the artifact down on the table with a sense of misplaced triumph. Now what? Corflick asked, eyeing the artifact like it might suddenly explode. "Now we wait for Lyra to work her magic," Jax replied, sinking into a chair that groaned under his weight. "And hope she doesn't take too long." Time passed in fits and starts, marked by the flickering of lights and the distant rumble of a city that never slept. Jax tried to relax, though it was like asking a cat not to be curious. His mind raced, flipping through scenarios faster than a cheap paperback. "Think we'll make it out of this?" Corflick asked, his voice unusually soft. Jax considered the question, the weight of it settling like a stone in his gut. "I don't know. But if we're going down, at least we're going down swinging wildly and without a plan." Corflick replied, managing a chuckle. "Sounds about right." Before Jax could respond, the communicator in his pocket buzzed. He pulled it out, half expecting it to be the council announcing their imminent arrest. Instead, it was a message from Lyra. "Got something. Meet back at the shop ASAP," the message read. Short, sweet, and ominous. "Well, at least she's efficient," Jax said, standing up with renewed urgency. "Back through the nightmare, then?" Corflick asked rhetorically. "Back through the nightmare," Jax agreed, leading the way. As they retraced their steps through the tangled network of the power grid, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Maybe it was the paranoia speaking, or maybe it was just the reality of life in a city that thrived on surveillance and secrecy. Either way, they couldn't afford to slip up now. The journey back to Lyra's shop was tense, every shadow seeming to harbor unseen threats. But they made it without incident, the door swinging open to reveal Lyra waiting, a look on her face that suggested news, good or bad they couldn't tell yet. "Glad you came quick," Lyra said, motioning them inside. "I think I've figured it out." "Music to our ears," Corflick quipped, though his anxious eye belied his light tone. "What's the verdict?" Jax asked, holding his breath. Lyra pointed to a series of charts and notes scattered across her workbench. "The artifact's a key, all right. A key to a vault buried deep beneath the city." "What kind of vault?" Jax asked, excitement mingling with dread. "The kind that holds the kind of tech that could turn this city on its head," Lyra replied, her eyes gleaming with dangerous promise. "Or, get us all killed." "Well, nothing ventured, nothing gained," Jax said, his mind already racing through a million possibilities. Corflick sighed, resigning himself to whatever came next. "So do we flip the city, or does it flip us?" "Guess we'll find out," Jax said, grinning despite the odds. They had a long road ahead, filled with threats and uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, Jax felt a flicker of hope, a dangerous thing in Astroluma, but there it was. Whatever lay at the end of this journey, they'd face it together, sarcasm and all. The council's enforcers were out in force, and the mood in Astroluma had shifted from mildly oppressive to outright menacing. Jax could feel it in the air, thick enough to choke on. It was the sort of atmosphere that turned a casual stroll into a tense, paranoia-fueled shuffle. Not that Astroluma was ever a city of friendly neighbors and bake sales, but today it had all the welcoming charm of a viper pit. "I think the council's competing for the title of world's most overbearing regime," Jax commented, glancing over at Corflick, who skulked beside him with an air of permanent anxiety. "Think they'd win?" Corflick shot back, his tentacles twitching nervously. "They've got the attitude for it. Maybe they'll throw in a book deal and some merchandise," Jax replied, keeping his voice low as they slipped into an alleyway. "Astroluma, where dreams come to die, has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Catchy." "I'd buy a t-shirt," Corflick said, mostly to keep his nerves from eating him alive. They had a plan. Well, Jax had a plan. Plans were things that gave the illusion of control in a universe that delighted in chaos, like trying to organize a dance party in a minefield. The artifact in his pocket wasn't just ancient tech. It was a possible communication device with a lost civilization, a whisper from a forgotten age. In theory, Lyra's going to meet us at the drop point. "If this thing's capable of talking with long-dead aliens, I'd like to be the one holding the receiver," Jax said, as they halted behind a stack of crates that seemed precariously close to collapse. "Makes sense. "You're the only one dumb enough to think they'd have anything good to say," Corflick quipped, his version of moral support. They navigated through back streets and overgrown paths, avoiding main roads where patrols would surely be waiting. The council had stepped up their game, and it was anyone's guess what had got their collective knickers in a twist. Probably the usual: rebellion, disobedience, sarcasm, Astroluma's trifecta of unforgivable sins. The drop point was an abandoned plaza, once a hub of activity, now a forgotten corner where the city's grime and neglect collected like unwanted memories. Lyra was already there, fiddling with a portable console and looking like she was ready to strangle anyone who got too close. "Glad you could make it," she greeted them, her tone as sharp as a shiv. "The enforcers are thicker than flea rats on a garbage planet today. Nothing like the threat of re-education to get you in the mood for a stroll," Jax replied, setting the artifact down on the makeshift table they'd arranged from a couple of old crates. "Let's get this over with before someone decides they need to redecorate our minds," Corflick added, forever the optimist. Lyra nodded, her fingers flying over the console with practiced ease. "So this is supposed to, what? Dial up ancient aliens and ask for a cup of sugar. That's the hope," Jax said, though he didn't feel particularly hopeful. "More like a man about to jump off a cliff with a parachute that might just be an anvil. You've got about as much chance of success as a snowball in a plasma storm," Lyra pointed out, plugging in the artifact with a crackle of energy that made the hair on Jax's arm stand on end. "Thanks for the pep talk," Jax said, rolling his eyes. "Let's just see if this piece of junk can even turn on." The artifact hummed to life, lights flickering along its surface in a rhythm that suggested it was thinking, or maybe just laughing at them. A screen on Lyra's console blinked, displaying symbols that could have been ancient wisdom or the cosmic equivalent of a toddler's doodles. "All right, let's see what kind of cosmic prank we're pulling," Lyra muttered, tapping commands that made the device beep in protest. For a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. Then the screen cleared, displaying a single symbol that even Jax's untrained eye recognized. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a word. "Is that hello?" Corflick asked, tentacles writhing with a mix of anticipation and dread. "Looks that way," Jax said, grinning despite the odds. "Now let's see if we can strike up a conversation, or just blow ourselves up in the process," Corflick said, his nerves getting the better of him. They tried everything they could think of: commands, questions, even a bit of shouting. The artifact responded with more symbols, none of which made any more sense than the first. The initial thrill of contact faded into frustration as the minutes ticked by, each one a reminder of just how far out of their depth they were. "This isn't working," Lyra said finally, slamming the console shut with a loud bang that echoed across the plaza. "Maybe it's a time zone thing. We could be trying to chat during their version of 3 a.m., Jax suggested, his attempt at humor falling flat against the growing tension. "Or we've just got the wrong number," Corflick added, his usual sarcasm tinged with genuine concern. "Let's pack it in for today," Lyra said, rubbing her temples, "before the council decides to drop by for a chat of their own." Jax couldn't argue with that. As much as he hated to admit it, the plan had failed, at least for now. They gathered their things, making sure to leave no trace of their presence before slipping back into the shadows. The walk back was silent, each of them lost in thoughts that were probably best left unspoken. It wasn't just the plan's failure that weighed on Jax, it was the knowledge that time was running out. With the council breathing down their necks, each day brought them closer to a future that was as uncertain as it was terrifying. When they reached Jax's abode, a cramped cavern that felt even smaller after their taste of open air, Corflick finally broke the silence. "So what's next?" "We keep trying until we get ourselves vanished. Not like we've got many other options," Jax said, slumping onto his makeshift bed which felt like a pile of rocks except less comfortable. "We could always try the sit and wait for death strategy. It's low effort and guaranteed results," Corflick suggested, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Jax chuckled, though there was little humor in it. I'll pass. I've always been more of a go-down swinging kind of guy. Lyra was leaning against a wall, arms crossed, lost in thought. She looked up, meeting Jax's gaze with eyes that held the weight of worlds. We'll figure it out. We've got to. I didn't come this far to let some relic beat us. Agreed. We'll regroup and come at it from a different angle, Jax said, though his words felt hollow, like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. As they settled in for another restless night, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that they were teetering on the edge of something much larger than themselves, something that could save them or destroy them. Hey, Jax, Corflick said from his makeshift nest of blankets and discarded clothing. Yeah, if we do somehow make contact with this dead race, what's the first thing you're gonna ask? Jax thought for a moment, weighing all the possibilities. I dunno. Maybe where they kept the good booze, Corflick laughed, a genuine sound in the midst of their uncertain future. Figures. You'd think they'd have had the foresight to preserve the important stuff. Here's hoping, Jax replied, allowing himself a small smile. Even in the darkest times there was room for a little hope, a little laughter, a spark in the void. The night stretched on, silent and oppressive, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Somewhere out there, Jax knew, the enforcers were plotting their next move, the council was drawing ever tighter around them, and an ancient civilization stood silent, waiting for someone foolish enough to unlock its secrets. But as he lay there, staring up at the rock ceiling, Jax allowed himself one last cynical thought before sleep claimed him. At least they'd given it a shot. In Astroluma, that was practically a victory. And who knew? Maybe, just maybe, the cosmic dice would roll in their favor tomorrow. It was a long shot, but as Jax had learned, sometimes long shots were all you had. The morning, or what passed for it in Astroluma's perpetual gloom, broke with its usual lack of enthusiasm. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, like the universe was just waiting for its chance to kick you right where it hurt most. And speaking of unpleasant kicks, the council had apparently decided to ramp up its vendetta against anything remotely resembling a good time. Word on the street was that sarcasm-related arrests had skyrocketed overnight. The enforcers had been busy, sweeping through the city like janitors of joy, scrubbing away any trace of humor or defiance. It was as if someone had decided that laughter was a form of treason. Jax could barely keep his eyes open as he leaned against the grimy wall of an alley, peering out at the empty street. His usual blend of paranoia and caffeine was keeping him somewhat alert, but the weight of last night's failure hung around his neck like a millstone. They'd gotten close. To what? He wasn't entirely sure, but it felt significant, like a mystery that was just begging to be solved, if only he could figure out the damn punchline. Corflick, his ever-anxious companion, was doing his best impersonation of a tentacled jack-in-the-box, popping open every few seconds to check for enforcers. The jittery alien was practically vibrating with nerves, and Jax couldn't blame him. The streets were quieter than a funeral in a vacuum, and just as cheerful. Think we'll get through today without being lobotomized? Corflick asked, his voice a mix of sarcasm and genuine fear. Unlikely, Jax replied, scanning the street for any sign of trouble. But hey, at least we're not getting any duller. Corflick's expression was a mix of exasperation and resignation. I hear they're giving away free sarcasm lessons in the re-education chambers. Might be worth signing up. Do they offer a group discount? Jax shot back, grinning despite himself. Might as well get our money's worth. The banter was a thin veneer over their shared anxiety, but it kept them moving. They had a new plan, or at least a half-baked one, which was more than they'd started with the day before. Jax had managed to contact a small group of human sympathizers who were willing to lend a hand. Or a voice, or whatever else wouldn't get them immediately executed. The meeting was set for a forgotten corner of Astroluma, where the city's neglect was as palpable as its corruption. Jax didn't expect much. He'd long since learned the value of low expectations, but he hoped for something. Anything that might turn the tide in their favor. They slipped through the back streets, shadows among shadows, each step echoing with the oppressive silence of the city. It was a wonder they hadn't been caught yet, but Jax didn't dwell on it. Luck wasn't something he trusted. It was like a fair-weather friend, always ready to ditch you when things got tough. As they rounded a corner, the air was suddenly filled with the unmistakable sound of enforcer boots, heavy, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. Jax barely had time to register the danger before a squad of enforcers rounded the opposite corner, their visors glinting menacingly. "Move now," Jax hissed, shoving Corflick into a narrow passage barely wide enough for a human, much less an alien with flailing appendages. They squeezed through the gap, hearts pounding, as the enforcers' footsteps grew louder. Jax could almost feel the heat of their pursuit, like a pack of wolves on the scent of blood. They emerged into another alley, but it was a dead end, filled with the detritus of a city that had long since stopped caring. "Great, just great," Corflick muttered, eyes darting around for an escape route that didn't exist. "Calm down," Jax said, though he knew it was pointless. "We'll figure something." Before he could finish, Corflick let out a strangled yelp, his tentacles spasming in panic. "Jax, it's too late." Jax turned to see the enforcers bearing down on them, weapons drawn, expressions hidden behind their ominous helmets. It was a sight that would have been terrifying if it hadn't been so damn predictable. Corflick tried to back up, only to trip over a pile of discarded machinery, crashing to the ground with a defeated groan. Jax cursed under his breath, debating whether to fight or flee, but the choice was made for him. "Stay where you are." One of the enforcers barked, weapon trained on Jax with the kind of precision that suggested years of practice. For a moment, Jax considered doing something stupid. But as he glanced down at Corflick, who was now whimpering pathetically, he bit back the impulse. "Fine," Jax said, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Wouldn't want to interrupt your power trip. Silence." Another enforcer commanded, stepping forward to cuff them both with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for the truly sadistic. As they were dragged away, Jax couldn't help but think that the day was off to a particularly dismal start. He could practically hear the Sarcasm band being whispered through the city, like a particularly crappy urban legend that had somehow come to life. The walk to the enforcer station was short and brutal, with none of the usual niceties such as "watch your head" or "please step this way." Astroluma hospitality at its finest. They were thrown into a holding cell that smelled like something had died there recently. "Well, this is cozy," Jax said, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had bitten into his skin. Corflick was a quivering heap in the corner, his tentacles wrapped around himself like a particularly miserable ball of yarn. "This is it, Jax, we're done for. Re-education or worse." "Cheer up," Jax replied, leaning back against the cold wall. "We might get lucky and just disappear." "Your optimism is frightening," Corflick shot back, though his voice lacked any real heat. They waited and waited. Time dragged on, each minute a reminder of their precarious situation. Jax tried to think of a way out, but his mind was a jumbled mess of half-formed plans and unhelpful sarcasm. Not exactly an ideal state for a jailbreak. Finally, the door swung open, and a wiry man with an air of practiced indifference stepped inside. He looked at them with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of a shoe. "Jax Viero," the man said, consulting a datapad with an exaggerated sigh. "And you must be Corflick. You two have been quite the nuisance." Jax shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Well, we aim to please, cute," the man replied, though his tone suggested he found nothing about the situation amusing. "The council has decided that you're to be held for further evaluation." Translation: "They're gonna scramble our brains like eggs," Corflick muttered, his usual flair for drama shining through. Jax shot him a warning look before turning back to their captor. "What's the going rate for letting a couple of innocent bystanders walk?" The man chuckled, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "Innocent? Hardly. But it doesn't matter. You're too much of a liability to let loose. Orders are orders. Jax's mind raced, searching for any leverage, any angle he could exploit. But all he had were his wits, and they'd never been particularly reliable. Just as he was about to launch into a desperate plea, the door swung open again, and Lyra entered, flanked by two other humans Jax didn't recognize. The wiry man seemed surprised but not alarmed, which was probably a bad sign. "Thought you might need some help," Lyra said, her voice carrying the slightest hint of amusement. "What's this?" the man demanded, though he didn't make any move to stop them. "Consider it an intervention," Lyra replied, pulling out a device that hummed ominously. "We've got a few friends who'd prefer Jax and Corflick remain unscrambled." The man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Jax held his breath, hoping Lyra's gamble would pay off. Finally, the man stepped aside with a grudging nod. "Fine. But you're on your own if this goes south. Wouldn't have it any other way," Lyra said, gesturing for Jax and Corflick to follow. They wasted no time, slipping past the guards and into the labyrinthine corridors of the enforcer station. It was a nerve-wracking dash through dimly lit halls, but Lyra seemed to know exactly where she was going. As they ran, Jax felt a flicker of hope, the kind that made him want to laugh despite the danger. Maybe, just maybe, they'd make it out of this mess with their minds intact and a chance to finish what they'd started. When they finally burst out into the open air, the world seemed brighter if only marginally. They'd escaped, but the council was still out there, waiting for any excuse to tighten their grip. "Thanks," Jax said, breathless but grateful. "Didn't think we'd make it." "Don't thank me yet," Lyra replied, glancing around for any signs of pursuit. "We've got a lot more work to do, figures," Corflick said, though his relief was palpable. "Can't just have one victory, can we?" Jax chuckled, feeling a rare sense of camaraderie despite the danger. "Wouldn't be any fun if it was easy." They regrouped in the shadows, planning their next move with the kind of reckless determination that had become their trademark. The road ahead was long and fraught with peril, but they were still standing. And in a place like Astroluma, that was something. As they disappeared into the city's depths, Jax realized that they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the chance to change their fate. One sarcastic comment at a time. Jax Viero sat hunched over the artifact, a piece of ancient tech that looked like a cross between a Rubik's Cube and an electric toaster. Except this toaster had more buttons, fewer crumbs, and was twice as likely to explode. Corflick hovered nearby, his tentacles twitching nervously like he was part octopus, part anxiety disorder. "Explain to me again why we're trusting our fate to something that looks like it was rejected by a garage sale," Corflick asked, his voice a blend of skepticism and existential dread. "Because, my gelatinous friend, this garage sale reject is our ticket to revolution," Jax replied, his fingers dancing over the controls with a confidence he didn't quite feel. "Or at least to a different brand of misery." Corflick made a sound that was halfway between a sigh and a gurgle. "I'd settle for less chance of immediate imprisonment." Jax snorted. "Aren't you the optimist?" He pressed a sequence of buttons, and the artifact responded with a series of beeps and flickering lights that might have been encouraging, or a countdown to detonation. "Let's hope that's a good sign," Corflick muttered, glancing around as if expecting enforcers to materialize out of the shadows. Given their luck, it wasn't an unrealistic fear. "Look, if this works, we won't have to worry about the council," Jax said, leaning back and studying the artifact's display, which now showed a string of symbols. "If it doesn't, well, I suppose we can always take up knitting in the re-education chambers." Corflick didn't laugh. His tentacles were too busy tying themselves in knots. "I'd rather not find out if I'm allergic to brainwashing, thank you." Jack squinted at the symbols, trying to make sense of them. They seemed to shift and morph, as if testing his patience. He tapped the screen, and suddenly the artifact emitted a low hum, a sound that felt like a prelude to something significant, or catastrophic. "Ah, there we go," Jack said with a forced cheerfulness. "I think it's speaking to us." Hopefully not to say goodbye, Corflick replied, inching closer as the artifact projected a holographic image into the air, a message in alien script that danced like a drunken spider across a web. Jack stared, a slow grin spreading across his face as he deciphered the symbols. Corflick, you beautiful blob, I think we've hit the mother lode. Should I be excited or terrified? Both, Jack said with a chuckle. Looks like our ancient friends were all about peaceful revolution. They left instructions for rallying the masses. With humor, Corflick echoed, dubious. In Astroluma, why not? It's the last thing anyone would expect. Like finding a sense of style in a bureaucrat, the alien's expression shifted to something approaching hope. Okay, but how do we use this? Jax tapped his chin, ideas forming like storm clouds. We rally both humans and aliens. Use humor and irony to inspire them. Show them that the Council's grip isn't as tight as they think. We'll turn sarcasm into a weapon. Corflick gave a tentative nod. Sarcastic rebellion. I like it. Probably because it's the universe's worst idea. Exactly, Jax said, clapping him on the shoulder. Now let's gather our ragtag bunch of cynics and start a revolution. The next few days were a whirlwind of clandestine meetings and whispered conversations. Jax and Corflick put out feelers among the disillusioned citizens of Astroluma, humans and aliens alike. Their pitch was simple: fight back with laughter, turn the Council's own absurdities against them, and maybe, just maybe, reclaim a bit of freedom. Lyra proved invaluable, her shop becoming an unofficial headquarters, a place where people gathered to plot and joke away the despair. She had a knack for coaxing information from the tightest lips, usually with a well-placed quip or a bottle of illicit brew. One evening, as they huddled around a battered table in Lyra's back room, Jax addressed the motley collection of rebels. Right, so how do we make tyranny more ridiculous than it already is? A burly human with a penchant for terrible puns raised a hand. We could distribute flyers with top 10 ways to get arrested for sarcasm. Number 1. Laugh in public, Corflick perked up, or broadcast a fake council announcement. Something like, mandatory nap time for all citizens, see how many take it seriously. Lyra smirked. How about a graffiti campaign? Big Brother is watching, but he's really bored. Jax nodded, excited. Perfect. We'll hit them with everything we've got. Show people they're not powerless. He paused, eyes scanning the room. And remember, we're not just doing this for us. We're doing it for everyone who's too scared to speak up. They spent the night planning, strategizing, and crafting jokes that cut deeper than any blade. As the hours passed, a sense of camaraderie built among them, a shared purpose that burned away the fog of fear. The first strike came in the form of a hacked broadcast. Corflick, who was surprisingly adept at digital subterfuge for someone with tentacles, managed to piggyback a comedic skit onto the Council's routine propaganda. The skit lampooned the Council's more ridiculous edicts, including the ever-lengthening list of sarcasm-related offenses. The city's response was electric. Jax could feel the shift, a crack in the Council's veneer of control. People laughed quietly at first, then with growing boldness as the skit spread through black market comms channels and whispered retellings in dimly lit bars. Next came the flyers, plastered across the city in bold, irreverent colors. They mocked the Council's paranoia, their oppressive laws. People snatched them up, some chuckling, others nodding with newfound determination. It was working. Jax could see it in the way people walked a little taller, a little less afraid. The Council was losing its grip, its authority fraying at the edges like an old rope. But the Council wasn't blind. They ramped up patrols, increased arrests. They dragged more people to the re-education chambers, desperate to maintain control. Jax knew they were playing a dangerous game, but the stakes were too high to back down now. As the rebellion gained momentum, Jax and his unlikely band of revolutionaries became bolder. They staged flash mobs, quick, irreverent protests that appeared and disappeared before the enforcers could react. Corflick even managed to rig a few electronic billboards to display satirical cartoons of council members, complete with exaggerated features and comical captions. Each act of defiance was a reminder that the council was not invincible, that their power was a facade propped up by fear and compliance. And with each small victory, more people joined their cause. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were close calls, moments when Jax's heart leapt into his throat, certain they'd been caught. But they always managed to slip away, aided by luck, quick thinking, and sometimes a well-timed distraction courtesy of Lyra's knack for mischief. One night, as they regrouped in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, Lyra turned to Jax, her expression serious despite the glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "You know, this is probably the craziest thing any of us have ever done." "Probably," Jax replied, an eyebrow raised in mock surprise. "I'd say it's a definite." She laughed softly, a sound that was both comforting and defiant. "Just making sure you know what you've started." "Oh, I know," Jax said, grinning despite himself. Revolution is just another word for improvised chaos, Quarflick, who had been uncharacteristically silent, piped up. "I'll admit I didn't think this would work, but seeing people stand up, laugh in the face of fear, it's kind of inspiring." Jax clapped him on the back. "See, you're an optimist too." "Let's not go that far," Quarflick replied, though the hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "I'm just enjoying the moment before everything inevitably goes wrong." They shared a moment of camaraderie, a shared understanding that while the future was uncertain, they were doing something that mattered, something that might, against all odds, make a difference. As they planned their next move, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The council wouldn't sit idle forever, but for now, they had the upper hand. And in Astroluma, that was something worth celebrating, even if only with a whispered joke and a shared smile in the dark. The days that followed were a blur of activity, each act of rebellion fueling the fire of resistance. More people joined their cause, some driven by desperation, others by a newfound sense of hope. The council's stranglehold was loosening, its power slipping through their fingers like sand. Jax knew they were living on borrowed time, that the council would eventually strike back with all the fury of a cornered beast. But he also knew they had momentum, a chance to change the narrative from one of despair to one of defiance. As they gathered once more in Lyra's shop, the atmosphere was electric with possibility. Jax stood before his ragtag band, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. "We've got the council on the ropes," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Now we just need to land the final punch." Quarflick nodded, his tentacles twitching with anticipation. "And how exactly do we do that?" "By being us," Jax replied with a wry smile. "By using humor, irony, and all the things they can't control to show them that we're not afraid, that we won't be silenced." Lyra leaned forward, her eyes alight with determination. "Let's give them something to remember." And so they did. They launched their most audacious plan yet, a city-wide prank that would turn the council's own propaganda against them. It was bold, reckless, and exactly the kind of crazy that Jax had come to embrace. As they set their plan in motion, Jax couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. For the first time in a long time, he saw a glimmer of hope on the horizon, a chance for something better, for a future where laughter wasn't a crime and sarcasm wasn't a death sentence. In the heart of Astroluma, the rebellion found its voice, and it was a voice that refused to be silenced. The air in Lyra's shop was thick with anticipation and the distinct aroma of desperation, which, incidentally, smelled a lot like sweat and old coffee. Jax was pacing back and forth, which was his usual exercise routine these days, running laps over the worn-out carpet in the back room. Quarflick's tentacles were twitching like they were practicing the foxtrot. Nice if you were at a wedding. Less adorable when you were about to incite a rebellion that could end with a one-way trip to the re-education chambers, a place with all the ambience of an unlicensed dentist's office. "So we're actually doing this?" Quarflick asked, his voice a cocktail of excitement and terror with a dash of "what the hell are we thinking?" "You bet your last tentacle we are." Jax replied, grinning like a man who just found a winning lottery ticket in a pants pocket he hadn't checked in years. We're going to broadcast the artifact's message citywide. Let's see how the council likes a little public service announcement that doesn't involve threatening lifetime supply of misery. Got my last tentacle right here, Corflick muttered, a tentacle curling up protectively. Lyra was leaning against the wall, a picture of casual defiance, flipping through a battered manual that purportedly explained how to operate the artifact without making it explode, probably about as reliable as a weather forecast on a planet with no atmosphere. Just remember, if this thing blows up, I'm not doing the paperwork. I hate paperwork. It's why I quit being a proper citizen. Jax stopped pacing and glanced at Lyra, who seemed to have mostly made peace with the fact that her shop might end up being known as the epicenter of the galaxy's most sarcastic revolution. Did I ever tell you how much I appreciate your unwavering support? Lyra smirked. You can buy me a drink later. Assuming we don't end up as a smoldering crater, Renzik, the self-proclaimed expert on ancient tech who had about as much credibility as a weatherman predicting sunshine during a monsoon, was fiddling with the artifact, his brow furrowed in concentration. I think I've got it, he said, his voice barely audible over the buzzing tension. If this works, the council will have a public relations nightmare on their hands. Good, Jax said. I hear they are overdue for one. Jax took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Let's light this firecracker. The plan was audacious, reckless, and exactly the kind of thing that made people famous or dead. Which one, Jax hadn't quite decided. They would hijack the council's broadcasting system, a convoluted mess of wires and outdated tech that was as reliable as a politician's promise. The artifact, as old as it looked, contained a message from a civilization long gone, urging unity, humor, and an understanding that even empires weren't immune to laughter. As Renzik finalized the connections, Jax glanced around the room. Corflick, Lyra, and Renzik, his partners in crime, his co-conspirators in sarcasm. It was nice to have friends when you were dancing on the edge of treason. Ready? Jax asked, more to himself than anyone else. As I'll ever be, Corflick replied, his tentacles still jittery. Hit it, Renzik. Renzik nodded and flipped a switch. The artifact hummed to life, glowing ominously, which was either a good sign or a precursor to them all turning into cosmic dust. The broadcast system crackled, and then there it was, a message spoken in a language lost to time but translated by the artifact into something they could all understand. Humor as a universal language, a reminder that every oppressive regime had a punchline coming. The voice was warm, full of laughter and life, a stark contrast to the council's usual droning propaganda. It was beautiful in a grimdark kind of way, like watching an art film about death and taxes. Is it working? Corflick whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the delicate moment. Oh, it's working, Jax said, watching as the message spread across screens throughout Astroluma, a cityscape suddenly alive with a message not dictated by fear. The response was immediate. Laughter, real, genuine laughter, began to ripple through the streets. It was a sound that hadn't graced Astroluma in ages, a sound that was as alien to its citizens as peace and quiet. Lyra's eyes were wide with amazement. They're laughing, she said, almost disbelieving. Jax grinned. Yeah, they are. It was like a dam breaking. People were stepping out into the streets, talking, laughing, sharing jokes about the council that were once whispered only in the safety of their homes. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a newfound hope, a taste of freedom that many had thought was lost forever. Of course, the council was about as thrilled as a cat in a rainstorm. Their enforcers were scrambling, trying to regain control, but they were like dogs chasing their tails, endlessly circling with no hope of catching up. Corflick was practically vibrating with excitement. We did it. We actually did it. Yeah, Jax replied, feeling a thrill of victory. For now, anyway, it wasn't a complete victory. The council was still there, an ever-present shadow looming over Astroluma like a bad hangover. But it was a start, a crack in the facade that was their iron grip on the city. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The council, overwhelmed by the wave of unified defiance, was forced to reconsider their stance. The ban on sarcasm was repealed, a concession that was both minor and monumental, a sign that things could change. Jax could hardly believe it. He stood in the middle of the street watching as people gathered in groups, talking openly, laughing without fear of retribution. It was a sight that warmed his cynical heart. Lyra joined him, a wide grin on her face. "Guess we showed them, huh? We did," Jax said, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. "We actually did." Corflick sidled up to them, his tentacles unusually still. "I didn't think it was possible, but you humans have a way of surprising people." "Yeah, we're good at that," Jax replied with a chuckle. "Probably because we have no idea what we're doing half the time." Renzik, looking smug despite his earlier doubts, walked over, crossing his arms with a sense of accomplishment. "I told you it would work." Yeah, Jax said, waving a hand dismissively. "Don't let it go to your head." The sense of camaraderie was palpable, a shared understanding that against all odds they had made a difference. It wasn't the end, not by a long shot, but it was a start, a step towards a future that wasn't dictated by fear and oppression. As the sun set on Astroluma, casting a golden glow over the city, Jax felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the harsh realities of life, but it was there, a beacon guiding them through the darkness. "Looks like we've got our work cut out for us," Lyra said, her voice filled with determination. "Yeah," Jax replied, watching the people around him, their faces alight with laughter and a sense of newfound freedom. "But it's a job worth doing." Corflick nodded, his tentacles undulating in agreement. "Here's to more sarcastic rebellions." Jax raised an imaginary glass, a grin on his face. "To sarcastic rebellions and to a future where laughter isn't a crime." With that, they stood together, watching as the city embraced the change they had started. It was a small victory in a galaxy full of challenges, but it was theirs, and that was something worth celebrating. As they walked back to Lyra's shop, Jax couldn't help but think of the journey they had undertaken, the friends they had made, and the battles yet to come. It was a daunting prospect, but with allies like Lyra, Corflick, and Renzik by his side, he knew they could face whatever the universe threw their way. In the end, it wasn't just about defeating the council or repealing a ridiculous law. It was about showing people that they had a voice, that they weren't powerless, and that even the darkest of times could be met with a wry smile and a well-timed joke. And that, Jax thought, was the true power of cynicism, the ability to laugh in the face of adversity and keep moving forward, one sarcastic remark at a time. The days after the broadcast were a carnival of chaos, an unexpected explosion of life that Astroluma hadn't seen since the last time someone tried to organize a fun run, which turned out to be neither fun nor a run when the council turned up. The streets were alive with a mix of exhilaration and disbelief, the air vibrating with something that might have been hope if you squinted and looked at it sideways. Jax stood on the corner of what used to be Miserable Street, now unofficially renamed Laughter Avenue by the citizens, who decided that irony was their new favorite pastime. He watched as people mingled, their faces transformed by the simple act of smiling, a sight he realized he hadn't seen in a while. His heart did a funny little flip, a somersault of surprise mixed with pride, like a gymnast who'd only just learned they were double-jointed. Corflick was beside him, tentacles swaying in a rare display of relaxation. He glanced at the crowd, then at Jax, his eyes full of a kind of cautious optimism that he'd only ever seen on people who were about to bet on the underdog. "You know, I didn't think I'd ever see the day when people in Astroluma looked happy." "Yeah, weird, isn't it?" Jax replied, his voice laden with a dry amusement. "Like finding a vegan at a barbecue." The rebellion had been more effective than any of them had dared hope. There was something about the sheer absurdity of it all, a message of humor and unity, delivered by a bunch of misfits with a penchant for sarcasm, that cut through the council's iron-fisted grip. It was as if the people of Astroluma had suddenly woken up and remembered they had a spine, collectively deciding that they were done being pawns in the council's joyless game of chess. And the council, well, they were currently licking their wounds, trying to figure out how they'd managed to lose control of a city to a group of rebels who thought sarcasm was a basic human right. Jax caught sight of Renzik across the street, in a heated debate with a wiry man who looked like he'd walked off the set of a dystopian spaghetti western. Renzik's arms were crossed tightly, clearly relishing the role of newly minted hero expert on ancient tech, though his credibility was still about as solid as a politician's promise. "Think he'll ever shut up about how he saved the day?" Quarflick asked, his tone a mix of envy and sardonic admiration. "Doubtful. But then again, we'd never hear the end of it if he hadn't saved the day, so I guess we're stuck either way," Jax replied, shrugging with the resigned air of someone who'd long ago accepted that life was a series of inconvenient truths wrapped in a burrito of disappointment. Lyra emerged from her shop, her face alight with a grin that could power a small city, assuming the city ran on defiance and caffeine. Well, if it isn't our very own celebrity rebels," she quipped, flicking a strand of hair out of her face with the casual grace of someone who knew exactly how irreplaceable they were. "You two gonna stand there all day gawking, or are you coming in for a drink?" Jax hesitated and then nodded. "Why not? It's not every day you get to toast to a rebellion without worrying about getting your head caved in by an enforcer." Inside the shop, the atmosphere was a heady mix of victory and disbelief. It smelled like burnt coffee and triumph, which, Jax thought, was a pretty good combination. The place was packed with people, all of them talking over one another in a symphony of chaotic joy. It was the kind of noise that could drive a person to madness, or, in this case, to a strange kind of happiness that was only slightly less terrifying. Lyra set about pouring drinks, her movements efficient and precise. "If anyone had told me last week that I'd be serving drinks to a bunch of jubilant insurgents, I'd have laughed in their face," she said, handing Jax a chipped mug filled with something that smelled like it could take the paint off a spaceship hull. "Yeah, well, laughter's all the rage now," Jax replied, taking a cautious sip and grimacing as the liquid burned its way down his throat. Who knew rebellion would taste like battery acid? Quarflick was already halfway through his own drink, his tentacles twitching with something that might have been pleasure or the onset of alcohol-induced convulsions. "You know, I think I could get used to this whole being a hero thing. It has a certain appeal. Yeah, right up until someone decides you're more useful as a martyr," Jax said, but there was no real bite to his words. He was too busy enjoying the moment, the rare feeling of having done something right. The celebration continued for hours, a blur of laughter, music, and the kind of reckless abandon that only comes from narrowly avoiding utter catastrophe. Jax found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand, slap him on the back, or just stand next to him in the hopes that some of his newfound notoriety might rub off. It was surreal and a little overwhelming, like winning a game you didn't even remember starting. Eventually, the crowd began to thin as people headed home, their spirits lifted by the promise of change. Jax, Quarflick, and Lyra found themselves sitting together at a corner table, the remnants of their celebration scattered around them like confetti at a very gritty parade. "So," Lyra said, propping her feet up on an empty chair, "what's next for the galaxy's most sarcastic band of rebels?" Jax shrugged, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I dunno. Maybe we could take up knitting." "I hear it's very therapeutic." "Yeah, right," Quarflick interjected, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You, knitting? I'd pay to see that," Lyra chuckled, leaning back in her chair with the air of someone who was genuinely content, a rarity in Astroluma. "Seriously though, what's next? We've poked the hornet's nest. You know the council's not just going to roll over and let this slide, of course not, Jack said, his demeanor shifting from whimsical to contemplative in an instant. But we've shown people that things can change, that they don't have to live in fear and that laughter isn't treason. That's a start. Quarflick nodded, his expression unusually serious. And the artifact. What do we do about that, the artifact? Jax mused, his mind drifting to the ancient device that had set this whole adventure in motion. It was still in Lyra's shop, nestled safely in a corner, its secrets both revealed and yet still tantalizingly out of reach. We keep it safe. Maybe there's more it can teach us. About the past, about how to keep this going. And in the meantime, Lyra asked, curiosity and caution warring in her gaze. In the meantime, we keep watching each other's backs, Jax said simply. Because if there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that there's strength in numbers. And sarcasm. The three of them sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of the day's events settling over them like a comfortable blanket. It was a rare moment of peace, the kind that felt both new and familiar, like finding a long-lost friend. Eventually Jack stood, stretching his limbs and wincing as his muscles protested. I should head home. It's been a long day, Lyra nodded, standing as well. Get some rest. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, and I'm not just talking about fixing the shop. I'll see you tomorrow, Jack said, a promise in his words. As Jax and Quarflick stepped out into the night, the city around them seemed to breathe in time with their own footsteps. The air was cool and clear, carrying with it the distant echoes of laughter and the promise of a new beginning. It was a city transformed, but still very much the same, a contradiction wrapped in a mystery, much like Jax himself. Hey, Quarflick said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Do you think we'll ever really be free? You know, free from the council and all that. Jax considered the question, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first stars were just starting to appear. I think, he said slowly, that real freedom is something you find inside yourself. It's not about the council or the laws or even the laughter. It's about choosing to stand up and be counted even when the odds are against you. So what you're saying is we're screwed. Quarflick replied with a lopsided grin. Jax laughed, a sound that felt right coming from deep within him. Yeah, probably. But at least we'll go down swinging. They walked together, side by side, two unlikely heroes in a galaxy that was vast and unfathomable, full of dangers and delights, dark humor and unexpected friendships. It was a daunting journey, but one that Jax felt ready to face, thanks to the allies he'd found along the way. As they turned a corner and Jax's cramped cavern of an abode came into view, he felt a sense of belonging that had eluded him for too long. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was enough. In the end, Jax thought, as he and Quarflick parted ways with promises to meet again soon, life was a series of choices. And today, they'd chosen laughter over fear, friendship over solitude, and hope over despair. It was a start, and that was more than enough for Jax Viero, rebel, cynic, and proud owner of a galaxy-sized chip on his shoulder. As he stepped inside, closing the door against the night, Jax couldn't help but smile. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and more than a few sarcastic remarks, but for the first time in a long time, Jax was ready for whatever came next. And with that thought, he fell asleep, a small smile still playing at the corners of his mouth, dreaming of new beginnings and the sound of laughter echoing across the stars.